Today I want to talk about the basics of the Python language. So first of all, we can look at a simple print statement where we're saying hello world. The point of this message is that the console will produce the output hello world, and it's a pretty simple statement. What we're looking at here is a string. And a string is short for a string of characters. And in Python, a string is all lowercase str. In order to print anything, you have to call the function print. So print is a built-in function, and it is part of every single Python program. Next, we can look at a simple Python function. So in Python, we declare a function using define, or def, and then the function name, so our name, and then in here we put in a list of variable names that they have to provide the function, and then we use a colon, and all the statements that function start indented. Anything not indented in the function is not part of the function, so that is why we see down here we call do nothing, and that is not part of the do nothing function. So do nothing, as you can tell, only executes one statement, which is pass, and pass does nothing. So it's kind of like an empty statement in Python. It's useful for this exact scenario where you have a function that is not completed yet, and you just want it to have a name and not do anything. So next we can look at a working function, which I've chosen to print somebody's name. So this function is called sayName, and it takes a variable called name. And here we print a string hello, comma, space, and in that string there, and we add name to that string. So for calling this function sayName with the string viewers, we get the result printed hello viewers. So that would be the output there. Pretty simple. Next we can look at another function called add. Here I've declared this function to have two variables, num1 and num2. I could have called these x and y, or a and b if I wanted to, but I chose num1 and num2. The entire function is to return num1 plus num2. And so we can assign the result of this function for the numbers 5 and 7 to a variable called num. So here we've created a variable called num, and so we can refer to num later on, and we do when we print it. Calling add with 5 and 7 produces 12. So num equals 12. Now we can print num, and it will print 12. So now we can proceed to iterators and for loops, basically. For x in the list or array 0, 1, 2, it's going to call or run this code that's indented in the for loop for every item in this list or array. So we're looking at calling print on 0, and calling print on 1, and calling print on 2. So the result will be 3 individual calls of print with each of these numbers. So we should see the result of 0, 1, and 2 being printed to the console or the output. Next we can look at for x in range 3, which is actually identical to this result. Range is a function that will generate a list or iterator like this one up to this number. So it is going to allow us to print 0, 1, and 2, but not 3. The reason being that 3 is the stop number or the end number, if you will. So this is the number of items it will print, not the highest one it will print. So again, we're going to see 0, 1, and 2 from this for loop. Next, we can look at another example, or some more examples. We've got a more advanced function here called called minimum. So we have a variable a and a variable b. We're just going to return a if it is less than b, and otherwise if a is equal to b or a is greater than b, we're going to return b. So we can see what this would produce if we call print minimum of 2 and 3. The minimum of 2 and 3 is 2, so that would be our output for that. Then we have a print minimum of negative 9.4 and negative 9.5. Now these are negative numbers, so the greater negative number, or it would be mathematically the lesser negative number, would be negative 9.5 here. So the result is negative 9.5 being printed. We move on to a little bit more complicated function called find smallest. Provided a list variable. So this variable would be a little bit more complicated because it's not just a number, it's actually going to be multiple numbers or multiple strings or whatever it could possibly be. Here we're assuming that we're going to be receiving numbers, floats or integers. So in this function, we're going to be looking for the smallest number in this list using a for loop. Now in order to do this, I chose to create a variable called smallest, and I made it equal to the largest possible float number, which is infinity. So here I'm calling the function float, which creates a float, and I gave it infinity, or inf, and it interprets that as an infinite float number. And so we're hoping that any number in this list has to be smaller than that, and we'll subsequently keep searching for any number smaller. So for number in list, which is our variable up here, if that number is less than our smallest, then our smallest equals n. And that loop will continue to run, finding the smallest until we're out of numbers in the list. Then we're going to step down here. We're going to return that smallest number that we were able to locate during our looping. So if we look for the smallest number in our list here of 5, 3, 6.2, and 1, we'll know that 1 is the smallest number here, so our variable 1 equals find smallest, 5, 3, 6.2, 1, print that variable or that result, which will be 1. If we move on to in place iterator mutations, I don't really know what you want to call it, where we can actually change an entire list of items in place without overwriting it. So here I've created a variable called myList, and I assigned it to this list of numbers, or it's actually 3 numbers and a string. I've got the number 2, which is an integer, and a floating point, 3.5, then a string, yo, with a space, and I've got negative 212.4, which is another float. Now I print this operation. Now this operation says, for v in my list, so we're looking at v specifically, which is creating a variable, we're going to say v times 2 for every item. So we're going to multiply every single item in my list when we print it. So the result is going to be printing this array. So we're going to print 4 because 2 times 2 is 4. and then we're going to print 7.0 because it's a float, so it always assumes there's a decimal at the end. So we're going to get yo space yo at the end. And finally, we're going to get negative 424.8. Kind of running out of room here. And I have that closing bracket there, which indicates the end of the list. So that would be the result of calling the print function here. Now, we're going to look at mutating our existing list. So here we have mylist.pop. We're calling a function called pop on our mylist. So pop is actually a function that is available on all lists by default. It just knows that this is a list of numbers or an array, and pop is an available function you can call by putting a period after the variable name of a list. So you say mylist dot or function name that you want to call on the list, and then the open and close parentheses indicates that it's a function you're calling, and it has no parameters and no inputs. So what this does is it will return the last number or the last value in your list, which here would be negative 212.4, and removes it from your list. So the result of calling this, even though it doesn't print anything, will be negative 212.4, but it will mutate our array. So now my list equals 2, 3.5, and yo Alright, so now we can look at mylist.append, which is another function we're calling on our mylist. With this time, we are inserting a number, which is, again, negative 212.4. I believe that was a typo. I did not intend to have that behavior, but that's okay. So we're going to be putting that number back in to our list. So the result is my list equals 2, 3.5, and yo with a space, and negative 212.4. That's square bracket. So that would be the result of calling this function here. Now we can call print, and we perform another inline operation on this here list. We say for v in my list, v divided by 2. So we're going to divide every item in my list by 2. So this isn't going to work because I made a typo here. This was not supposed to be here. So this entire value wasn't supposed to be here in the beginning. It was supposed to be the string. So whenever you called this, it wouldn't show any of this. And then whenever you popped, it would have actually popped this number or this string. And so there wouldn't be a string. And I would have added this negative number. So this isn't going to work because you can't divide a string by 2. But you know what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to divide this negative 212.4 by 2. So hope you learned a little bit of something from this video about the basics of the Python language.